My name is Marilyn Jennings. I'm 64 years old, a retired high school teacher, and recently a widow. After 41 years of marriage, I thought the hardest part would be losing my husband. Turns out it was realizing my own son had been waiting to take control the moment he was gone. But what Lucas didn't know was that Edward left me everything and trusted me to use it well. This is the story of how I turned quiet heartbreak into quiet power. If you've ever felt underestimated by your own family, stay with me. This one's for you. They say grief comes in waves. But for me, it arrived as silence, thick, heavy, almost sacred. On the morning of Edward's funeral, I stood in front of the mirror, buttoning the same black wool dress I wore to my father's memorial a decade earlier. My hands paused over the pearl brooch Edward gave me on our 25th anniversary. I pinned it just above my heart where it belonged. The woman looking back at me had aged, yes. Creased skin, silver hair swept into a low twist. But she stood tall, not because she felt strong, but because she had to. Edward and I were married for 41 years. He died 12 days ago. Pancreatic cancer, cruel and fast. I'd left my teaching job at Ridgefield High early, 7 years before retirement age, to care for him full-time. I'd fed him, bathed him, helped him to the bathroom, and sat beside him each night whispering stories of our younger days while he drifted in and out of medicated sleep. We'd made our whole life together in that house. 2 kids, 1 stillborn, 1 miracle who made it to college. That miracle now stood beside me, straightening his charcoal gray tie in the hallway mirror, saying, "Let's not drag it out, Mom. It's just family and a few neighbors." Lucas always had a way of compressing big emotions into tight, efficient sentences. The service was short and tasteful, held at the small chapel on Main Street. The minister said kind things, but it was the floral arrangement Jenna had picked out that told me what kind of day it was going to be. Bright yellow lilies. Edward hated lilies, said they smelled like sadness. We drove home in Lucas's black Audi. I sat in the back seat like a guest of honor in a procession I didn't ask to lead. Ridgefield passed by slowly. The bakery where Edward proposed, the bookstore where I worked part-time before his diagnosis, the park where Lucas fell off his bike and lost a baby tooth. The world had moved on, but I was still stuck in that hospital room holding Edward's cooling hand and promising I'd be okay. What I didn't realize was that I should have also promised I'd protect myself from our son. Lucas and Jenna stayed for dinner after the service. I insisted on cooking. It grounded me. Mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, Edward's favorite roast with rosemary and garlic. As I moved through the motions, I realized my body knew what to do even when my mind didn't. They arrived without flowers, but with a leather-bound folder Jenna slid onto the dining table beside the salt shaker. We hadn't even cleared the plates when Lucas leaned forward, his voice gentle in a way that felt practiced. "Mom, we've been thinking. Now that Dad's gone, it might be too much for you to keep up with everything by yourself." I looked at him, my only child. A man who once clung to my pant leg when he couldn't sleep through thunderstorms. "Your father took care of all the finances," he continued. "Bills, insurance, taxes. Now that he's gone, we think it's best if we step in. We'll handle things just until you're settled." He smiled like he was doing me a favor. Before I could even open my mouth, Jenna reached for the folder. "We've done some research. There's this wonderful assisted living place near us. It's called Pinebrook Hills. Gardens, art therapy, on-site medical. You'd love it." She opened the folder to a page with a soft focus photo of a gray-haired woman smiling at a jigsaw puzzle. "It's just a tour," she added, her manicured fingers tapping the page. "Nothing's been decided." I reached for my glass of water, trying to steady my hands. "You think I can't live on my own?" "No, of course not," Lucas said too quickly. "We're just concerned. The house is big, a lot to manage." The house? Edward's hydrangeas still blooming out front, his tools still hanging in the garage just the way he liked them. His shirts folded by my hands still warm from the dryer this morning. "I'm 63, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Jenna smiled sympathetically. And 63 is the new 80 when you're grieving. I didn't respond. I didn't shout. I just picked up a serving spoon and quietly dished out more potatoes. If they were listening, they'd have heard my silence thundering. After they left, I stood by the window staring out into the backyard. The porch light buzzed and the swing Edward built creaked gently in the breeze. My legs felt weak, but not from grief. From the realization that my own son, the boy I raised to be thoughtful, kind, and respectful, had already decided my life was no longer mine to lead. They thought they were helping. That was the worst part. They called it love, but it looked a lot like control. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. They weren't preparing me for comfort. They were preparing to take over. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but convenience. I was becoming a logistical problem to solve, not a person to support. I went to the bedroom, sat at Edward's side of the bed, and pulled his cardigan over my lap like a blanket. I whispered, "They think I'm fragile, Ed. They think I need managing." I waited for the silence to answer. But deep inside, something shifted. The first flicker of steel beneath my sadness. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the last time I let someone else define what I could or could not handle. Let them think I was wilting. They'd find out soon enough. I was just getting ready to bloom again. 3 days after we buried Edward, I got the call that changed everything. It was late afternoon, the kind where the sun slants just enough to make you feel like the world is tilting a little. I had just finished folding the last of Edward's sweaters, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. I couldn't bring myself to pack them away yet. My phone rang and I recognized the number immediately. Gerald Spencer Edwards' longtime attorney. "Marilyn," he said in that slow, respectful way lawyers often speak when grief is still fresh. "Edward left something for you. A personal letter. He asked that I deliver it directly. No intermediaries. Can you stop by tomorrow morning?" I barely managed a yes. That night, I barely slept. I sat in Edward's chair by the window staring into the dark garden where he once hung twinkle lights, just because he knew I liked them. He hadn't mentioned writing me a letter, but of course he would. Edward was that kind of man. Quiet, thoughtful, always 5 steps ahead when it came to taking care of me. Still, I felt a nervous flutter in my chest. I hadn't expected to hear his voice again. Not like this. The next morning, I dressed with intention. A simple blouse and slacks, flat shoes, hair pulled back in a loose twist. I didn't want to look like a grieving widow, though. That's exactly what I was. I just wanted to feel composed enough to face the next unraveling thread. Gerald's office was above a florist shop, the same building it had always been. The smell of roses and eucalyptus clung to the stairwell as I climbed the narrow flight. He greeted me with a kind smile and ushered me into the office. No small talk, just a man fulfilling the final wishes of a friend. He handed me a sealed envelope. "My instructions are to leave you alone while you read it," he said, gesturing toward the leather armchair by the window. I nodded. My fingers shook as I broke the seal. The envelope was thick. 2 folded pages written in Edward's unmistakable hand. Steady, slanted, deliberate. I could hear his voice in every loop of ink. "My dearest Marilyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and for that I am sorry. Not because I fear death. We've talked enough about what comes next. But because I hate to leave you carrying everything alone. Except, my love, you are not alone. Not really. You've never been. I need to tell you something important. Something I've suspected for a while now. Our son loves you in his own way, but I fear his love has been warped by entitlement, or perhaps by his wife's influence. I've seen it in small things, how he speaks about your needs, how he talks about managing your affairs when the time comes. That time, apparently, is now. I don't want you to feel cornered or helpless, Marilyn, so I've made sure that everything is in place. Everything you need to live freely and on your own terms. The house is yours paid in full. The deed is in your name alone. The investment account. Yes, the one I never mentioned, is solely yours. As of last quarter, it held $1.2 million. Conservatively managed, but liquid. My life insurance will pay you $500,000 no tax burden. And the car. The old Mustang I tinkered with in secret for years. It's in showroom condition. You'll find the title in the file I left with Gerald. Estimated value $60,000. You are not dependent, Marilyn. You are equipped. And if Lucas or anyone else tries to say otherwise, I want you to remember this. You owe them nothing. Not your obedience, not your deference, not your assets. You are wise. You are capable. You are more than anyone's afterthought. Live boldly, my love. I trust you. Forever yours. Edward. By the time I finished reading, I couldn't see the words through the tears. I clutched the pages to my chest, his familiar handwriting trembling in my hands. I cried not just from grief, but from the overwhelming tenderness of being protected. Even now, even after death, it was as if he had reached across time and pulled me upright again. Gerald returned quietly, as if sensing I had finished. I can walk you through the accounts when you're ready, he said. There's more paperwork to file, but... Edward was thorough. You're well-positioned, Marilyn. Exceptionally so. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. I wasn't ready to talk about money. Not yet. Not when all I could think about was how Edward had watched our son drift towards something unrecognizable, and had loved me enough to prepare for the fallout. That night I read the letter again in bed beneath the quilt my mother had sewn decades ago. Outside wind tapped gently against the window pane like a soft warning. Lucas didn't know any of this. Neither did Jenna. They thought they were maneuvering a helpless woman into a corner, but Edward had handed me the key before they even started drawing the lines. And something in me, something buried beneath years of caregiving, budgeting, meal planning, and quiet compromises, something started to awaken. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The Ridgewood Living Estate brochure was made of thick, glossy paper. Jenna handed it to me with the kind of excitement most people reserve for weddings or luxury vacations. Isn't it beautiful, she beamed, tapping a photo of a bright modern sitting room with flower arrangements and an electric fireplace. We called ahead. They're expecting us Saturday morning for a private tour. Lucas chimed in as he reached for his coffee. It's one of the best facilities in the state, Mom. No pressure. Just come see it. It's upscale, discreet, and honestly, you won't have to lift a finger. I smiled faintly, thanking them, and tucked the brochure into the junk drawer by the refrigerator. I didn't need to look at it to know what I'd find. But I agreed to go, because sometimes the best way to understand someone's intentions is to let them speak uninterrupted. Saturday came with crisp spring air and blue skies that made everything feel falsely hopeful. I wore a navy cardigan over a soft blouse and slacks. Comfortable shoes, modest earrings. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look like exactly what they saw. A cooperative aging mother trying to do the right thing. Lucas and Jenna arrived promptly at 9:45. Lucas wore khakis and a casual blazer. Jenna had on a lemon-colored wrap dress that matched her cheerful tone a little too well. You look lovely, Mom, she chirped as she hugged me. You'll love this place. So elegant. The drive to Ridgewood was smooth and silent. Jenna filled the quiet with pleasant commentary about how close the facility was to their house, how convenient family dinners could be, how many activities they offered. You'll have such a full calendar, she said brightly. They even have a book club. Book clubs were not new to me. I'd hosted one in my own living room for 20 years, long before Ridgewood decided to market it as a luxury amenity. The entrance to Ridgewood Living Estate looked like a boutique hotel, polished stone manicured landscaping, a wide circular drive with valet parking. As we pulled up, I noticed the subtle security cameras tucked under the eaves watching the comings and goings of every resident. We were greeted by a well-dressed woman named Vanessa. She had the crisp diction of someone who'd sold timeshares in another life. So lovely to meet you, Mrs. Harland, she said, shaking my hand firmly. Lucas and Jenna have told us so much about you. That told me everything. This was a pitch. Not a tour. Inside the facility was clean and well lit. Neutral tones, fresh flowers, classical music humming gently through hidden speakers. It looked nice. Pleasant even. But it felt sterile. Polished in a way that didn't invite living-only existing. We began in the dining hall where lunch was being served, trays with baked fish, mashed carrots, and bland-looking rice. No salt on the tables. The scent was institutional. Residents sat at small tables in quiet pairs or alone. Some needed help cutting their food. Others simply stared at their trays. Nutritious and professionally prepared, Vanessa said with a smile. We have a rotating seasonal menu. I nodded. Do they ever cook for themselves? Vanessa blinked. Each apartment has a kitchenette, but most residents prefer not to worry about groceries and cleanup. We moved to the recreation area, a large sunny room with folding tables covered in pastel tablecloths. Bingo was underway. A volunteer in a Ridgewood polo shirt called out numbers, while a dozen seniors sat with daubers, eyes fixed on their sheets. The prizes on display were trial-size lotions and peppermint candies. A woman clapped as she won a round, her prize a roll of paper towels. My stomach turned. These activities keep our residents stimulated and socially engaged, Vanessa explained. We also offer yoga guest speakers and movie nights. I said nothing. Lucas smiled like he'd just won an argument. We visited a sample apartment next. It was small. One room sectioned into a sleeping area and a sitting nook with a narrow window facing a row of hedges. This is about 420 square feet, Vanessa said. Fully furnished. Monthly rates start at $4, $200 all-inclusive. I turned to Lucas. And how long would that last? He paused. What do you mean, how long would my money last if I were paying $4, $200 a month? He scratched his cheek. Well, you wouldn't be paying it alone necessarily. Jenna jumped in, voice chirpy as ever. There's Medicaid. If you ever ran out, the state helps. I looked at her closely. You've already thought about me running out. Her smile faltered. Just being practical. I turned back to the room. It was quiet. Too quiet. I imagined myself in that bed, staring at the same shrub every morning, waiting for scheduled meals, being praised for winning hand lotion. I asked, and what happens if someone wants to take a trip? Or visit family for a month? Vanessa blinked again. Well, the rent continues, of course. But yes, we do allow short-term absences with advance notice. So I pay even if I'm not here. It guarantees your space, she replied smoothly. We ended the tour with a sit-down in Vanessa's office. She handed out folders labeled with my name printed on the front. Ridgewood would love to welcome you as part of our community, she said. I smiled gently. Let me think about it. On the way home, Jenna went on about the amenities again. Movie nights, craft classes, supervised day trips. Lucas chimed in with, It's a safe, beautiful place, Mom. And you'd be close to us. We could visit weekly. I stared out the window, watching the spring trees blur past. When we reached my driveway, Lucas turned off the engine and asked, So what do you think? I looked at him, then at Jenna. Their eyes were hopeful, but not in the way of children wanting their mother to be happy. No, their hope was colder, more calculated. They were hoping I'd say yes, because if I moved to Ridgewood, they'd know where I was. They'd know what I spent. They'd control what I owned, what I sold, and what I gave up. I'll think about it, I said again, folding my hands over my purse. Jenna smiled, relieved. Take all the time you need, but I had already decided. The answer was no. Not because I was offended, not because I was ungrateful, but because I saw it clearly now. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing control of me. And they were about to learn the difference. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to know about. Gerald Spencer, Edward's longtime lawyer, called me one morning with a tone I'd never heard from him before. Measured, hesitant, lined with something like caution. Marilyn. He said, I want to inform you of something your son requested yesterday. Not to alarm you, just to ensure you're aware. I held the phone tighter. Go on. He sighed. Lucas contacted me asking for access to your financial documentation. He claimed you were in emotional distress following Edward's passing, and that he wanted to ensure your affairs were handled properly. I went still. He specifically asked if it was possible to establish an emergency power of attorney. Gerald continued, a temporary conservatorship based on what he referred to as your fragile state of mind. I didn't respond right away. My mouth had gone dry. I, of course, refused. Gerald added, without a court order and a medical evaluation, it's not possible. And frankly, there is no justification. I've spoken with you, seen you handle everything, grief included, with grace and lucidity. I managed a soft, bitter laugh. So now I'm mentally unstable. Marilyn, he said gently. I don't believe that for a second, but I thought you should know what's being said behind closed doors. I thanked him. We hung up, and I sat in silence. That call was the final piece of the puzzle. I had been clinging to a sliver of hope that perhaps Lucas and Jenna were simply misguided, that their suggestions, their brochures, their cheerful manipulation had come from concern, however clumsily expressed. But this was not concern. This was control masked in the language of care, and in that moment the voice of Edward returned to me, clear as the morning breeze through the kitchen window. You are not helpless, Marilyn. You never have been. That afternoon, I pulled out Edward's letter again. Not to cry this time, but to remember. He had known. He had anticipated this exact betrayal. And he had left me not just wealth, but warning. It was time to act. I sat down at the dining table and opened my laptop. My fingers didn't tremble this time. I opened every account. I changed every password. Banking, brokerage email, even the home security app Edward had installed before his final hospital visit. I ordered a new safe. I shredded old statements. I opened a new account under a trust name that neither Lucas nor Jenna would recognize. And I filed paperwork with Gerald to revise all legal authorizations. Lucas was no longer my emergency contact. That role now belonged to a professional fiduciary, an independent legal representative trained to act without bias or personal agenda. I paid the retainer out of the trust fund Edward had left me and made sure the instructions were airtight. I even called our insurance provider and had all policies redirected. By sunset, every thread that could be pulled by anyone but me had been cleanly severed. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something deeper, heavier. I felt the quiet ache of being seen as weak. Not just by the world, but by the child I raised. Lucas had grown up watching me balance budgets, grade papers until midnight, cook dinner from scratch, attend every PTA meeting, and hold Edward's hand through a terminal illness. But all of that, it seemed, had faded behind a single dismissive narrative Mom can't manage without help. He hadn't said it outright. But he didn't need to. Trying to gain legal control over someone's life is a declaration louder than words. That night I sat on the back porch with a cup of mint tea, watching the early stars blink to life. The wind stirred the wind chimes Edward had bought for our 30th anniversary. You were right, I whispered into the dark. You saw it before I did. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. I was awake. And awakening comes with a clarity that cuts through even the deepest grief. It wasn't about the money. It was about the insult, the assumption that I would crumble, the belief that my age had dimmed my mind, the quiet plan to shuffle me off into comfort while my assets were shuffled into someone else's control. They thought I wouldn't notice, but I had. And from that moment forward, I would make sure they never got the chance to try again. It began oddly enough with a Google search. I'd typed in something vague one afternoon between bills and tea, volunteer work for retired teachers, and expected a list of local libraries or maybe a community tutoring program. Instead, I found a doorway, A site called Global Shelter Project appeared midway down the page. Their mission was simple: build homes for underserved families in rural areas across Latin America. No flashy branding, just pictures of volunteers in t-shirts and work gloves standing next to modest homes made of brick and pride. The listing read, "Seeking volunteer coordinators for our Guatemala site. 3-month commitment. Basic Spanish, helpful fluent English required. Organizational skills. Patience and willingness to live simply a must. Housing and meals provided." I sat back blinking. 3 months in Guatemala. I hadn't left the country since Edward's conference in Toronto 12 years ago. And yet, something in me stirred. Not fear, not hesitation, but a quiet, undeniable pull. My hands, the same ones that had cradled textbooks, stirred soup and held Edward's in the final hours. Those hands still had purpose. They still had work left in them. I read the posting again, then bookmarked it, then read it again later that night. And the next morning, I applied. The online form asked about my background, my skills, my motivations. I was honest. I told them I was a retired history teacher, that I'd helped manage school events, fundraisers, community programs, that I wasn't afraid of hard work or foreign soil. I ended my submission with a line I didn't think about until after I'd typed it. I'm not looking to escape. I'm looking to contribute. I didn't tell Lucas or Jenna. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I was finally doing something that didn't require their permission. 2 days later, I received an email from a woman named Camila Ruiz, the regional coordinator. She wrote warmly welcoming me to their next rotation. They'd had a cancellation, and my background made me a strong fit. If I could arrive by the 12th of next month, they'd hold a spot. It felt like being offered a key to a door I hadn't realized was locked. Meanwhile, life in Cedar Ridge continued on schedule, as if unaware that my axis had shifted. Lucas and Jenna arrived that Sunday evening for dinner. Her in a new blazer, him in his usual pressed khakis. They brought dessert and smiles and 3 new brochures. "You won't believe these, Mom," Jenna said brightly, placing them next to the salad. "We did some more research, and these places are incredible. One even has a saltwater therapy pool," Lucas added. "And one's right near our neighborhood, so you could see us anytime. They offer escorted day trips to parks and concerts." I nodded, listening with a polite smile. I said nothing. Instead, I brought out the beef stew Edward used to love, the same recipe I'd made every other Sunday for years. The scent filled the room. Thyme, bay leaf, a touch of wine, and wrapped around us like memory. Jenna picked up her spoon. This is lovely." Lucas looked at me. "So, what do you think about the new options?" I tilted my head thoughtfully. "I think the carrots turned out just right this time." He smiled, slightly confused. "No, I meant the living options." "Oh," I said as if it had slipped my mind. "Well, I appreciate all the research you've done. Truly, it's thoughtful." Jenna leaned forward slightly, sensing progress. "We just want you to be safe, comfortable." Of course, I said, ladling more stew into their bowls. "And tonight you can help keep me safe and comfortable by doing the dishes after dinner." Lucas blinked. Jenna laughed, though it sounded more forced than amused. They did the dishes. They dried them too. And I watched as they moved through my kitchen. My space. With the temporary obedience of people who still thought they were in charge. After they left, I sat at my computer and reread Camila's email. I looked at the images she'd sent. The little construction site, the villagers with weathered smiles, the volunteers covered in paint and sun. I looked at the map. Guatemala felt closer than it ever had. This wasn't about escape. This was about stepping into the life I was still allowed to build. A life no one had the right to redirect or manage. They had tried to box me in, wrap me in plush corridors and planned schedules. But I'd found a door. And this time I was the one turning the key. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those gray Iowa days when the sky can't decide whether it wants to rain or sulk. Lucas called that morning. "Mind if I swing by for lunch?" "Mom, I've got a break between clients." I said sure, not because I wanted to, but because I was ready. We sat at the kitchen table with turkey sandwiches and carrot sticks, a routine meal in a house that had been anything but routine lately. He talked about work, about the housing market, about a friend's new car. I nodded, kept pace, let the silence hum between subjects. Then, halfway through his sandwich, he said it, casually, like one might ask about the weather. "Mom, are you sure you've got enough saved to be flying around the world at this point in life?" I set my glass of water down. He looked up at me, eyebrows slightly raised, a mixture of concern and something sharper, something closer to suspicion. I mean, with flights, accommodations, insurance. Retirement income isn't exactly unlimited, especially without Dad's checks coming in. There it was, the soft clamp of a leash being slipped around a neck masked in polite tones. I stood up slowly, walked over to the sideboard drawer Edward used to keep locked. "I wondered when you'd ask," I said calmly. From the drawer, I pulled a cream-colored folder. Thick, neat, unassuming. I placed it on the kitchen table between our plates. Lucas's eyes followed it, his fingers still gripping his sandwich. "What's that?" he asked. I opened it. Inside were copies, just copies, not originals, of my full financial summary title deed to the house paid in full. Summary of an investment account with a balance of $1.2 million. Life insurance policy, $500 thousander payout deposited last month. Details of municipal bonds and conservative growth funds Edward had held. A scanned appraisal of the classic Pontiac GTO Edward had restored in secret, now valued at over $70,000. Lucas didn't touch the papers. He just stared. Dad hid this from us. "Not hid," I said, folding my hands. "He protected it. There's a difference." Lucas finally reached for the investment summary, scanning the numbers, as if waiting for a mistake to leap off the page. This is more than I ever imagined." "I know." He looked up. "So all this time, he just kept it from the family." I shook my head gently. He didn't keep it from the family. He kept it for the part of the family he trusted. Lucas blinked. It wasn't cruel. I didn't say it to wound. I said it because it was the only way to start pulling the truth out into the light. This money, I continued, was never meant to be dangled in front of anyone. It wasn't meant to be distributed in spreadsheets or discussed behind closed doors. It was meant to give me options. Options I've earned. Lucas sat back, arms folded. "You should have told me." Why, I asked, keeping my voice soft. "So you could decide how I used it. So you could budget my future, the way you budgeted that assisted living plan." He flinched. "Don't you trust me?" I considered the question. It deserved consideration. "I trust that you believe you're helping," I said. "I trust that your intentions come partly from care. But I also trust what I've seen." I gestured to the brochures still sitting on the counter from Sunday's dinner. "I've seen how you plan for my future without asking about my present. I've seen how you assume I'll fall apart if left to make decisions on my own." "I was trying to be responsible," he muttered. "It's a lot to handle. The house, the bills, everything." "It is," I agreed. "It's a lot. And I've been handling it." We sat in silence for a long moment. Then I leaned forward slightly. "Lucas, you can choose which version of yourself you want to be in my life. But you can't be both." He tilted his head, confused. "You can be my son," I said. "Or you can be my financial manager. But you cannot be both." He blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said gently, "that if you want to be part of my life as my son, I welcome that. I want that. But that role doesn't come with access to my bank accounts or influence over my decisions." He opened his mouth, closed it again. I let the silence do its work. "I'm not angry, Lucas," I said, standing up. "But I am awake now. And I'm drawing some lines." He looked down at the documents again, his jaw tight. Why didn't Dad trust me? I sighed. Maybe he did. Once. But somewhere along the way he saw something shift. And so did I. I gathered the papers back into the folder and walked them to the desk. Lucas stood up, the weight of what he'd just learned pressing into his posture. He paused at the door. I didn't mean to make you feel controlled. I know I said not unkindly, but you did, and now I'm choosing not to let that continue. He left with fewer words than he came in with. I watched from the window as he drove away, his taillights disappearing into the haze. In the stillness, I made myself a fresh cup of tea. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clarity has a quiet taste to it, like peppermint on a winter morning. Sharp, but soothing. Edward had left me more than money. He had left me the power to say no. The first thing I packed was Edward's old flannel shirt. It still smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap, and I folded it carefully into the bottom of my backpack. Not because I needed it, but because I needed him. The rest followed quickly: a change of clothes, a pair of sturdy shoes, my reading glasses, sunscreen, a tiny tin of mints, and a worn paperback I'd taught every spring to restless high school sophomores to kill a mockingbird. I'd underlined the same sentence every year. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. I was considering things now. My house, once filled with the comfort of memory, had turned into a museum. Every corner echoed Edward's absence. Every drawer whispered stories of a woman I used to be. So I let it go. Not recklessly, but purposefully. I withdrew just enough cash for the trip. No more, no less. I set up the house with a third-party property manager to rent it out short-term and donated most of our belongings to local charities, furniture, clothes, dishes. I kept only what felt like bone-deep essentials. A needlepoint Edward's mother had stitched one photograph of us at the Grand Canyon, my wedding ring, and the first love letter he ever wrote me. The rest I released. I wasn't running from my life, I was stepping out of its shell. Before I left, I launched something small but meaningful, a personal blog titled Life After 60, Notes from a Free Woman. The name came to me over toast. Not defiant, not showy, just honest. I typed the first post with trembling fingers. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to live without asking for permission. My name is Marilyn. I'm 63. I'm a widow, a mother, a former teacher. And I just booked a flight to Guatemala with a backpack and a question. What if it's not too late to start again? The words didn't feel brave until I read them back. Then they did. The flight to Guatemala connected through Houston. I remember that because it was the first time I ever changed terminals on my own without Edward nearby. I carried my passport like a fragile glass, double-checked every gate, triple-checked the ticket. My feet ached from walking, but my spine stayed straight. At the Guatemala City airport, I was met by Camila, the volunteer coordinator I'd been emailing. She was warm and steady in her mid-30s, with sun-browned skin and eyes that missed nothing. She drove me and two younger volunteers in a dusty truck up winding roads until the city disappeared into hills and color. The village of San Jacinto was unlike anything I'd known. Dirt roads wound between painted concrete houses, most no larger than my garage back home. Children waved at us as we passed some barefoot, some riding battered bicycles with more rust than rubber. And yet the moment I stepped down from the truck, I was greeted not with pity or hesitation, but with joy. There was a dignity to this place, not because of what it lacked, but because of what it held: gratitude, generosity, grit. On my third day, I met a boy named Mateo. He was 11 with curious eyes and a streak of mischief in his smile. He watched me hammer nails into a frame, sweat dripping from my forehead. "You're really building?" he asked in Spanish-tinged English. I smiled. "I'm really building. No one told you to?" "No." He looked confused. "So why?" I paused, setting down the hammer. "Because I want to help." He thought for a moment, then grinned. "You're the first old lady here who builds without needing someone to say it's okay." I laughed, breath catching in my throat. First old lady. It wasn't meant cruelly. It wasn't meant at all. Just truth. And in that truth, I felt something shift. I wasn't a widow here. I wasn't a financial worry or a woman being watched over. I was a person. A capable person. That evening, I sat outside the volunteer guest house, watching the stars rise over San Jacinto. The air smelled like wood smoke and tortillas, and in the quiet I pulled out my notebook and wrote, "Today I built a wall." Not metaphorically, a real solid sun-drenched wall. My arms are sore and my nails are dirty. But no one asked about my age. No one asked if I had a man. They just handed me a hammer and said, "Gracias." And somehow that's more permission than I've ever been given. The next morning I pressed publish. My blog post received 3 comments and 6 likes. It was enough. Because for the first time in years, I didn't need validation to know I'd done something that mattered. It started with an email. Subject line, "We need you, Mom." I was sitting under a tin awning in San Jacinto sipping cinnamon tea after a long day of hauling cinder blocks. The rain tapped the roof like someone too polite to knock, and I'd just finished writing my next blog entry when the ping sounded from my inbox. "Lucas, Mom Jenna's pregnant. We found out 2 weeks ago and we're overjoyed, but we're scared too. Everything's happening so fast. We could really use your help once the baby comes. Jenna's parents live out of state and honestly, we need you. Can we talk?" There were no accusations in the message. No mentions of assisted living, no financial questions, just a plea. But underneath it I heard the same rhythm. We need. We want. We expect. I sat for a long while before replying. Then I didn't reply at all. Because something else happened first. The next morning I received a call from a number back home in Ridgefield. It was a woman named Marcy calling from Brookhaven Senior Living. Her voice was light, practiced the kind used in hospital lobbies and funeral homes. "Hello, Mrs. Jennings. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I said nothing unsure where this was going. I just wanted to follow up. Lucas Jennings has been in touch with our admissions office multiple times inquiring about availability and services. He mentioned he was researching options for you." I blinked, swallowing the thick wave of disbelief. "For me?" "Yes, ma'am. He seemed quite eager. Asked if you'd qualify for any financial assistance programs." I just wanted to confirm. "Has there been any change in your plans?" I smiled tightly, though she couldn't see it. "No change, but thank you for letting me know." After we hung up, I sat very still. Pregnancy, panic, and now control, repackaged as concern. It was always the same pattern, love, when convenient, intervention when denied. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, I took out my old leather folio, the same one Edward had once used to keep business contracts. Inside were my legal documents, house deeds, investment statements, my passport, and a half-written letter I'd been meaning to revisit. I reopened my will. The original version, signed 2 months after Edward died, had listed Lucas as the primary beneficiary. Back then, I still believed in the ties that bind, still assumed blood came with care. But now I pulled out a pen. 60% of my estate would go to Global Shelter Project, the organization that had reminded me my hands could still build something real. 30% would go toward a new scholarship fund I'd been quietly researching. The second START fund for adults over 50 seeking new careers or retraining. 10%, the part that brought tears to my eyes, would go to establish a free reading center in Ridgefield named after Edward, where anyone, regardless of age or income, could access books, tutoring, or just a quiet place to sit and learn. I read the updated draft twice. It felt right. Then I added one final page, a letter. Not legally necessary, but emotionally vital. Lucas, if you're reading this, I've likely left the world with the same quiet resolve I lived much of my life. I want you to know this decision wasn't made out of anger, but out of clarity. You asked for me when Jenna got pregnant, but you didn't ask who I had become. You needed help, not relationship. and for too long I confused the two. If you only see me as useful when I have money or time to spare, then it's time you relearn what family means. Love isn't a safety net you deploy during crisis. It's a presence, a respect, a recognition of worth. Even when the person in front of you no longer serves your plan. I loved you as only a mother can. And I still do. But I love truth more. Be well, Mom. When I finished writing, I folded the letter and slid it into the folio. There was no ceremony, no defiance, only peace. In Guatemala, the sky burned deep orange and children were chasing each other through the dusty street below. Somewhere nearby, a woman stirred beans over a wood fire. The smell reminded me of late afternoons in Ridgefield when life had felt simple and small. And yet here I was, 63 years old, with nothing in my name but a house rented out to strangers and a bank account now tied to meaning instead of obligation. Lucas hadn't yet understood it, but I had. I wasn't his financial backup plan. I wasn't anyone's safety net. I was a woman who had finally remembered who she was. The email from Gerald Spencer arrived just after sunrise. I'd just returned from a construction site in Belize, my hands still aching from lifting bricks and mixing cement. The internet in the guest house was spotty, but this message came through loud and clear. Like a bullet. Subject: Guardianship Petition. Filed by Lucas Jennings. I sat on the edge of my cot, the breeze from the oscillating fan brushing against my neck as I read the contents. Lucas had gone to court. He'd officially filed a petition for financial guardianship, claiming that his 63-year-old mother, me, was mentally unfit to manage her affairs due to prolonged grief and cognitive decline after Edward's death. I blinked. Read it again. He didn't even call first. The phone rang not 2 minutes later. "Gerald! Marilyn," he said, his voice heavy. "I wanted to call you before you saw the document, but I suppose Lucas beat me to it." "He didn't call me," I said, my voice steady. There was a pause. "I want you to know I'll fight this. Every word of it. But I won't lie to you. It's a slap. A deep one." I closed my eyes and let the weight of his words settle. It didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like a mirror. Lucas wasn't just worried. He was threatened. By my freedom, by my clarity, by the fact that I had built a life that didn't orbit around his, and this petition was his final attempt to reassert control, by rewriting the story through the courts. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into the blog I'd created months ago. Life After 60 Notes from a Free Woman. I clicked New Post and I titled it "The Final Gift My Son Gave Me Absolute Clarity." And then I wrote, "He filed legal papers today. My son, the boy I carried in my body, taught how to read, nursed through chickenpox, stood beside at his wedding. That boy has now asked the state of Oregon to declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own finances. Why? Because I booked a flight. Because I gave away furniture. Because I started living." The petition says I'm emotionally impaired following the recent loss of her spouse. My husband Edward died 6 months ago. He left me with love, not confusion. He left me with resources, not desperation. He left me with instructions to trust myself. And I am not declining. I am awakening. And that awakening has terrified the very person who once called me the strongest woman he knew. Lucas believes control is love. That safety is something to be imposed, not chosen. That aging means surrender. But I do not owe him my compliance. I do not owe him the illusion of frailty. I owe myself the truth, and the courage to stand by it, saying, if this is what it means to be free, then so be it. If love must come with paperwork and signatures and courtrooms, then I no longer recognize it as love at all. I hit publish, and something astonishing happened. The post began to spread, like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 40,000 times. Women from all over the country. Florida, Montana, Vermont, even Canada, were reposting it with captions like, "My daughter tried the same. We are not disposable. Marilyn, you are all of us. I received messages from grandmothers, retired nurses, widows who had been pressured into downsizing or letting go. They spoke of bank accounts moved without permission. Mail intercepted even medication monitored by grown children with too much authority and too little understanding. It wasn't just my story, it was ours. Somewhere in the middle of that night, I sat on the front steps of the guest house, barefoot in the Belizean heat, and stared at the moon. Gerald had already drafted our response. The court date would be set soon, but he was confident. You're lucid, organized, functioning at a high level. We have documentation letters, receipts. The law is on your side. But what shook me wasn't the legality. It was the moral chasm between us. My son had looked at my autonomy and seen a threat, at my joy and seen instability, at my dreams and seen a crisis, all because I dared to stop shrinking. And in a strange way, I was grateful. Lucas had shown me something no soft conversation ever could. He showed me that freedom unsettles those who seek control. He showed me that love without respect becomes possession. And he showed me that the greatest clarity sometimes comes in the ugliest wrapping. So I named that gift, and I moved forward. 1 year after the petition, the court and the storm, I found myself standing under the orange-pink sky of Morocco, watching a circle of girls take turns reading aloud in English. Their laughter echoed against the adobe walls of the newly built reading room, my reading room. It had taken 6 months of fundraising permits, supply chain wrangling, and dusty travel across bumpy mountain roads. But it was real now. A modest building with colorful cushions, shelves of gently used books in 3 languages, and a simple solar fan humming from above. I had built it with the help of local teachers, volunteers, and the kind of quiet purpose that grows when no one's telling you who to be anymore. We called it the wind room because girls here were often told to be like wind, invisible, silent, soft. I told them instead, the wind can lift roofs, carve canyons, sail ships. You're not made to disappear. I was 64, and I had never felt more useful or more at peace. Back in the guest house, I checked the email account I only looked at once a week now. There was one unread message from Lucas Jennings. Subject, Re Your Life. I stared at it for a moment, then clicked. Mom. I give up. Do whatever you want. I don't get you anymore. I don't know what this is about. Maybe you're happier like this. Maybe I'll never understand you. But I've stopped trying. It was the most honest thing he'd written in 2 years. No threats. No guilt. Just frustration. And maybe beneath it a flicker of surrender. I replied simply, Lucas, I don't need you to understand me. I only need you to stop calling control love. I hit send, and that was that. No dramatic reunion, no tearful apology, just the slow, inevitable shift of gravity that comes when someone realizes they no longer orbit your world. Meanwhile, my blog had taken on a life of its own. What started as a place to process grief and defiance had become a movement. Readers emailed me from Brazil, Italy, and Kansas. Women wrote to say they'd canceled retirement home tours. Book clubs named their groups Life After 60. A woman in New Mexico tattooed one of my lines on her forearm. You are not fragile. You've just been told to break quietly. Then came the email from a small publisher. They wanted to turn the blog into a book. I laughed when I read it. Me, an author. But 6 months later, it was printed, No One Asked What I Wanted, One Woman's Journey from Widowhood to Freedom. It sold more copies than anyone expected. Part memoir, part manifesto, part field guide for post-60 reinvention. And while the royalties weren't life-changing, the letters were handwritten ones, emails, comments on social media from people who whispered, Thank you for saying the thing I was never allowed to say. I didn't do book tours. I didn't go on television. I didn't even put an author photo on the jacket. Because this story was never about fame. It was about freedom. One evening, after a long day of teaching reading skills and hosting a letter-writing circle, I hiked a little ways outside the village. The Moroccan desert was breathtaking, silent, golden, vast. I sat on a flat rock, a thermos of mint tea beside me, and watched the sun slide toward the horizon. I thought of Edward. It had been nearly 2 years since he passed, but I felt him with me more now than ever before. Not in the ache of missing him, but in the strength he'd helped build in me. He'd always believed I was more than a caretaker, more than a teacher, more than a mother. He'd believed I could be a woman who changed lives, even if the first life I had to change was my own. I spoke softly into the wind, half prayer, half promise. You taught me how to be a wife, Edward, but your death, it taught me how to live. The desert didn't respond. But I didn't need it to. I had already heard everything I needed to know in the voices of children learning to read, in the gratitude of villagers who now had light to study by, in the stillness of my own heart that no longer beat out of fear or obligation. I was no longer anyone's dependent, no longer anyone's project, no longer anyone's burden. I was Marilyn Jennings, and I was finally completely, gloriously free. If you've ever felt overlooked, silenced, or managed instead of loved, then maybe like Marilyn, you know what it's like to be treated as someone else's responsibility instead of your own person. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your freedom? Tell us in the comments, because your story might be the one that helps another woman find her voice. And if Marilyn's journey moved, you don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you never miss another story of quiet strength, dignity, and the power of a woman who remembers her worth. You're not alone, and it's never too late to start living on your own terms.